Aloha and welcome to the monthly public presentation of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. Since 1990, the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii has been following our mission of promoting human health, animal rights, and protection of the environment by means of vegetarian education as we've grown to become one of the largest all-volunteer nonprofit vegetarian societies in the nation. It's now time to introduce our special guest. We're delighted to have back with us tonight Jonathan Balcombe, PhD. Jonathan Balcombe is a biologist, author, and lifelong animal advocate. He has a PhD in ethology from the University of Tennessee, where he studied communication in bats. He has published over 50 journal articles and book chapters ranging from turtle nesting behavior to the ethics of animal dissection. His 2006 book, Pleasurable Kingdom, is the first in-depth examination of animals' capacity to enjoy life. His subsequent books, Second Nature and The Exultant Ark, also present animals in a new light and anticipate a revolution in the human-animal relationship. His latest book, the New York Times bestseller, What a Fish Knows, explores the private lives of the planet's most misunderstood and maligned vertebrates. Dr. Balcom is Director for Animal Sentience with the Humane Society Institute for Science and Policy based in Washington, D.C. He is also founder-editor of Animal Sentience, the first scholarly journal of animal feeling. A popular commentator, he has appeared on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, the BBC, the National Geographic Channel, and in several documentaries, and has contributed features and opinions to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Nature, and other publications. He currently lives in Florida, where in his spare time he enjoys biking, baking, birding, buck, and trying to understand the lizards on his patio. His presentation tonight is entitled, What a Fish Knows. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Balcombe.
Last time I was here, 2011, I wore my lei for 2 days because it smelled so good. I actually slept with it on. It was wonderful. So today has already been a good day because I've snorkeled not once but twice today. Kailua, and I forget the name of the other place, but somewhere up the East Coast. It was great. Any day that I can see real fishes swimming around in their real habitats is a good day. It's like another planet in there. When I was 8 years old, I climbed into an aluminum rowboat with the elderly director of a summer camp north of Toronto. And he rowed us a quarter mile out into the bay, and we spent the next 2 hours fishing. I caught 16 fish that night. Most of them were little ones let go back into the water, but some of the bigger ones were kept for breakfast the next morning. Mr. Nelson did all the dirty work, baiting the hooks with wriggling earthworms, pulling the hooks out of the fish's reluctant lips, and plunging his knife into the keepers. I was a sensitive boy with a soft spot for animals, and a lot of what went on in that boat disturbed me. I worried that some of those fishes had survived the knife and were still alive in that basket hanging over the side. I fretted privately about the worms. But this kindly man in the bow didn't seem to think there was anything wrong, and so I rationalized that it must be okay. I never took a shine to fishing. I lost interest when it came time to bait my own hooks. I just couldn't help seeing it from the fish's perspective. That was 50 years ago. And to this day, as then, we generally view fishes through one of two contexts, as a source of food or a source of pleasurable entertainment, a nice relaxing way to spend a Sunday afternoon, provided you're not the fish. In fact, so benign and beloved is fishing in our culture that it is a sort of a symbol of all that's good about life, a sentimental kind of symbol. Just as an aside, a colleague recently told me that They consulted DreamWorks about this logo many years ago and said, do you have to use fishing? And they said, well, there's actually no hook, there's no fish, there's no animal harm intended in this logo. The boy is fishing for dreams. Okay, fair enough, but nevertheless, the fact that they used that motif, which normally plays out with an animal on the end of the hook, does say a lot about the place of fishing in our culture. Well, tonight I want to encourage you to see fishes in a new light, through a different lens. I've spent the last 5 years swimming with, researching and writing about fishes, culminating in this book. I wrote this book because as an ethologist who delves into the scientific literature, I spend a lot of time reading journal articles and the latest studies on animal behavior, how animals think and how animals feel. It's a very lively field now, very exciting time to be an ethologist. And I was encountering a lot of really interesting information about fishes, and I had a lot of the biases that we tend to have, that they're rather primitive and they're not really, they're sort of in the cellar of the group of all the vertebrates, and I labored under those delusions. I don't anymore. And I want to try and convince you now over the next 4.5 hours of my lecture. They didn't tell you that? I want to convince you that there's so much more going on in a fish's life. Let's start out with just a bit about the biology, in particular the diversity of fishes. We are actually, unbeknownst to most people, we're living in an age of fishes. Fishes are incredibly successful, and that success can be measured by their diversity. There's this, I keep meaning to update this slide, it's actually over 33,000 species of fishes that have currently been described. At least one of them, maybe one that I saw today, actually. Yeah, the barracuda right there. I saw a barracuda today, small one. Anyway, there's two major groups of fishes. The bony fishes are teleosts, and the cartilaginous ones, or the chondrichthyans, to use a more fancy name. The latter is the sharks and the rays. So there's two representatives of the chondrichthyans, of which there's about 1,500 or so species worldwide, and then the remaining 32,000 or so are the bony fishes, the salmon, the eels, the tarpons, the more familiar ones that we generally talk about. I mention that because those two groups of fishes that we loosely just collectively call fish are as distinctive from each other evolutionarily and biologically as birds are from mammals. So we're really living in an age with 6 major classes of vertebrates, not 5. We just generally lump them all together as fish, and you'll notice that I tend to favor fishes, the word fishes. I decided to do that quite early on in this project because a central message that I'm trying to convey, and I will try to convey it tonight, is that these are individuals. They're all individual animals. They're unique individuals with personalities even. And if I go hiking and I don't come back and I say I saw 30 bird and 15 mammal today. I say birds and mammals. I pluralize it. So I think this word fish, I know there's bison and there's other words that we use a singular for a plural, but I want to try and reinforce the idea that these are unique individual creatures with lives, not just alive, with biographies, not just biologies. And so I've decided to use the word fishes, so you'll note that. It may sound a little awkward, but I'm using it because how we use language says a lot about how we view animals. So, moving on with diversity. As you may expect with a very diverse group of animals, they come in a great range of shapes and sizes. This is arguably the smallest vertebrate on Earth. It's a little fish, a little goby that lives in a few lakes around the Philippines. And you can put 300 adults of these fishes. They wouldn't like it, but you could theoretically put 300 on one side of a scale and then an American penny on the other side of the scale, and the American penny will slowly go down. They're that tiny. At the other end of the scale, so to speak, is the ocean sunfish. This is the largest, heaviest bony fish. It also has the greatest size increase known from any vertebrate. It goes from, can grow from a tiny egg to a 100-year-old, 1.5-ton adult, increasing in size by 60 million times from that egg. That's a pretty cool record. Another superlative that can be applied to fishes, and this isn't in my book, this has actually come out subsequent to the publication of my book. One of the hazards of writing books is that, darn, I didn't get that in the book because it came out afterwards. So maybe What a Fish Knows Part 2 in another few years. But anyway, this is a Greenland shark. It is now the new record holder for longevity among vertebrates on this planet. Sadly, 23 specimens incidentally caught by fishermen in the Arctic waters where they live were analyzed. The scientists asked for their eyes. That's all they needed because they can measure corneal layers, which are laid down yearly, just as tree rings can be used to count the age of a tree. And one of the sharks in this study had 392 corneal layers. This animal was almost in his or her 5th century of life, almost 400 years old. And several of the other ones analyzed were also very, very elderly. At least we think they're elderly. These were healthy animals when they were caught. Maybe there are some out there who are 500-600 years. We don't know. Maybe that'll come to light. They're kind of secretive. They're swimming under ice much of the time. They're very slow growing and slow moving most of the time as well. Greenland sharks. I love some of the names given to fishes. Whoever named this the clown triggerfish, I think, deserves a little prize. And then we have the local Hawaiian state fish. We might call it the Picasso triggerfish. I think that's a lovely name. Many of you probably know the Hawaiian native name for this, and I can't impress you because you probably know it, but I always say it for audiences in other locales who've never heard of it. The Humu Humu Nuku Nuku Apua'a, which is, as far as I know, the longest fish name. Stands for, you may not know what it stands for, it apparently means the fish who sews with a needle and grunts like a pig. That is significant because fishes actually do make a lot of sounds. They make a wide range of sounds, different species. And I imagine this one does actually make a grunting sound, perhaps with the teeth, perhaps with the pharyngeal teeth, some of the bones rubbed together, maybe using the what's called the swim bladder, which is a gas-filled organ which allows them to control buoyancy. It also happens to be a very good resonating chamber to make sounds. Fishes are actually quite sound-oriented, many of them. We just don't hear most of those sounds because they're below the surface of our senses. Some fish names are not quite so flattering. One of the least flattering fish names, I think, would be the sarcastic fringehead, which is one here. I certainly wouldn't want to be called a hairy-jawed sackmouth, and that is what this deep-sea anglerfish is called. I love this name, diagonal-banded sweetlips. I don't know about you, when I see those lips, I want to just pucker up and give them a big kiss because they are adorable lips. I mean, those lips are so, whoever named those sweet lips deserves a Nobel Prize for fish naming. Now we have toadfish. There's about 40 different species of toadfishes described by scientists. There are probably more. There are dozens of new species of fishes being described every year. It's estimated there may be 40,000 species out there in the oceans and the fresh waters for that matter. And look here, a toadfish doesn't even have fins. You can watch YouTube videos of toadfishes and batfishes and some other weird ones walking along the bottom of the water, just like animals on land. These are stealth predators. You can see they're very well camouflaged. They have this broken up coloration that allows them to blend very well into the background. Then you have fishes like the flatfishes who, during what must be a rather awkward adolescence, have to suffer the indignity of having one eye migrate from one side of the face to the other. It's a very useful adaptation. It allows them to have better depth perception, which is a good tool for being able to catch prey that may be 3 or 4 feet away when you launch your attack. It's good to know how far away it is to time that attack well. By the way, the eye can migrate as quickly as 5 days. I had a radio interviewer who said, so does it just disappear on one side and pop out the other? And I said, no, it actually migrates. Somebody somewhere must do a time lapse of that. I haven't seen it myself, but it would be very interesting to see that eye actually moving across the face to the other side. This is a deep sea anglerfish, another example. We saw a couple earlier. And this brings me to what arguably is probably the most bizarre sexual system among vertebrates. You may notice the two things on the bottom here have eyes. These are two males. It's hard to find the right female if you are a deep-sea anglerfish. You're living in the largest habitat on Earth, largest livable habitat by volume. It's dark. It's called the abyss. It's where the light never penetrates 24/7. It's not completely dark. Why? Because pretty much every fish species living down there in that huge habitat has a relationship with symbiotic bacteria that colonize in certain strategically useful parts of the body, such as a dorsal fin that can be used to make flashing pulses of light to help identify you as the right species. So the males who have good vision are probably cueing in on that. Those lights can be also used to trick other species, to lure in food, to communicate various things. So it's very useful that they have these symbiotic bacteria living on them. Anyway, these two males, probably at different times during the life history of this much larger female, females are generally much larger in these deep sea anglerfishes, of which there's about 160 known species. There are probably many more. If a male finds the right female, he doesn't want to miss the opportunity. He may not find another one for a long time, if ever. So what does he do? He bites her. He bites, and that's the last bite he'll ever take. He latches on, and he becomes fused into her flesh. In time, he shares her bloodstream, and he can even intravenously inseminate her. So scientists came up with the term sexual parasitism to describe this, and in terms of the fact that he's latching on, she's doing all the housekeeping, she's feeding them both. In that way, it does seem a bit parasitic. But considering that a female's reproductive life history is a dead end if she doesn't have at least one male latch onto her, it's not all about parasitism. It may be not that unwelcome to her. I don't think we should assume that she doesn't welcome having these males. Maybe they do swim a little bit and help her propel her along. I mean, maybe we don't know that, but we shouldn't assume it's just a negative relationship. They are, after all, mates. It's just a little, well, it's a menage a trois in this case, but it's a little complicated. It's a little unusual, but extenuating circumstances lead to some bizarre adaptations sometimes in nature, and that's certainly one. How do fishes sense their world? Fishes probably invented the sensory systems that we're aware of: vision, smell, hearing, taste, touch. But they also have other senses. They probably invented the sense of color, vision, by the way. There's also other ones like balance and the sense of pleasure and pain. Those are important. I'm going to come back to those a little bit later. But one that's sort of unique to fishes is the specialized scales that detect changes in pressure and movement in the water. We can probably relate to this. We feel our hairs on our skin move when we're swimming, but they have a much more acute ability to do this. It's a row of scales along the side, of specialized scales that have a depression in them, this concave shape, which casts a shadow, causing that row to look darker. And it's called the lateral line. And there's little tiny gel cups in each of these with a filament in the middle that is very responsive to movement, changes in pressure and movement of the water. And it allows fishes like this blind cavefish to swim around in the dark. They live in a dark habitat, not the abyss, but in caves, the light sometimes never penetrates. So they've evolved there. Their ancestors had vision, and they don't, because it costs energy to produce eyes. And so they're blind because they don't need eyes. But they have this lateral line, which studies at the University of Oxford have shown that they can learn to navigate very quickly around their environment to avoid hitting those rocks, etc., even when they're moved around and changed in location quickly, using this combination of the lateral line and a perfectly functional brain to memorize that surrounding. Then we have electroreception. You can guess what that is: the ability to detect electric signals. Sharks and rays have this. They have a whole bunch of little pores around their heads called the ampullae of Lorenzini, named for the Italian physiologist from the 17th century who first described these. And they're very sensitive to electrical pulses in the water. So a little creature could be hiding under the sand. Sadly for its heartbeat may give off a little pulse of electrical activity that this shark can pick up and can find that little creature hiding in the sand to eat the creature using this electroreception. Some bony fishes take electricity to a whole other level. They use it as a communication tool. They produce their own electric pulses. These knife fishes, so named for their knife-like shape, from South America. There's also a completely separate group called the elephant nose fishes in Africa, named for the shape of their faces. Both these groups, and there's many species in them, they use electricity and their own electric signals in very sophisticated ways to communicate various things. I'm interested in having sex with you, or I'm hungry, or I'm going to pass through your area now. I'm going to stop making any signals because I don't want to freak you out. So it's kind of like deference by a fish. And this picture here just shows how they will change their own frequencies to avoid confusion if their EODs, or electric organ discharge, is very similar. By the way, they live and they evolved in murky water. And vision, once again, is not very useful in that environment. What do fishes perceive? How are they processing sensory information? What's going on? These are ambon damselfishes. I saw some damselfishes on my snorkeling outings today, not these particular species, but they have a very interesting visual face recognition system. I should just say that recognition of individuals is not the exception among fishes. It's the rule, it's the norm. Any study of social behavior in fishes has found individual recognition. They recognize each other as individuals just as we do. But ambon damselfishes have a pretty cool way of recognizing each other. Each of them has a face that has a constellation of dots that are like fingerprints. They're unique to individuals, and they learn to recognize individuals with this. The other part about it is that these are only visible under ultraviolet light. This is actually a picture of the same fish under visible light for us and most other fishes, and then under ultraviolet. And most of the enemies, most of the creatures who interact with ambon damselfishes cannot see in this light spectrum, so they're not compromising their quite useful yellow camouflage against the reef, against that brightly colored reef, by having this system. So they're able to see each other covertly and recognize each other covertly without compromising their safety. I think I'm even more interested, though, in how fishes perceive optical illusions. This is the Ebbing House illusion, in which the two orange or red, I don't know, they're sort of orange on here, the two orange dots are actually the same size, but because of the arrangement of blue dots around them, this one looks larger than the other. We just perceive it that way. You can train various fish species to choose the larger of two circles and then present them with this, randomized of course, and they will in this case go up and push their nose or squirt water at, or whatever the training method is, and indicate that this is the one they think it's larger. You train them by giving them a food reward for choosing the larger of two circles. Very simple. They learn that, and they will fall for that illusion the way we do. They also fall for the Mullerlyer illusion, in which the two lines are the same length, but by dint of the arrangement of arrows, this one looks longer. If you train red-tailed splitfins, for instance, to choose and get food reward when they choose the longer of two lines, and then you present them with this illusion, they'll go to this one and they'll choose this one. Bamboo sharks and other species will perceive and indicate they perceive a triangle in this so-called Canisa triangle. There is no triangle in that image. It's just assumed by the arrangement of black figures that there's this white triangle that pops right out. We perceive that, so do they. I think there's something poignant about fishes perceiving a visual illusion the way we do and falling for it. It says they're fallible. It suggests they can have beliefs. They believe that dot is bigger than the other one. And so it says something about them seeing the world the way we do, at least in that way. Do fishes think? Do they have brains? Do they have minds? Yes, of course they do. They have good brains. Here's a nice example. This is one of the great heroes of vertebrates for having memory, spatial memory. This is a little 4.5-inch long, very humble, pouty-mouthed, quite cute-looking little fish of coastlines. It's called the Frofin goby, and its habitat is actually this kind of thing. This is what's called an intertidal zone. It's those tide pools that are left when the tide recedes, and then they're covered up again when the water comes in. People had noticed that Frofin gobies are able to jump accurately from one tide pool to another, and they can actually work their way all the way out to the ocean. Here's a schematic. They can jump from pool A to C out into the open ocean. The question is, how do they know how to do it? How do they know which direction? How do they know how far to jump? Well, a series of experiments done in captivity way down there in New York City at the Natural History Museum was done starting in the late 40s through the 1970s, and involved building a false reef. And what was discovered was the Frofin goby memorizes the reef topography at high tide. So the water comes in, The fish swims over all this, swims down into these nooks and crannies, makes what's called a mental map in the mind of the Frofin goby, and then when the water recedes again, is able to translate that aerial view, if you like, into a horizontal view, and thereby to jump accurately the right distance, the right direction from one tide pool to another. By the way, why would it need to do that? Well, if an octopus comes lurking or a heron wants to eat the fish, then you want to get out of there, you want to move. These are archerfishes. They're named for squirting water. And why do they squirt water? Well, they don't do it all the time. Most of the time they're catching prey, insect prey, or food, other kinds of food underwater, not insect. Well, it can be underwater insects. But if an insect flies by, they actually will squirt water at it through a barrel-shaped mouth. They close their gill covers, and they're very able to squirt water 10 feet. So it's quite a powerful jet of water. You can watch YouTube videos that show how they control the size and shape of the bolus to optimize catching that target, depending on what kind of insect it is. They're probably quite able entomologists. They probably learn to recognize a dragonfly versus a fly versus a moth, for instance, because it might require a different bolus of water to catch that. And it turns out, careful studies have shown that there's an apprenticeship in this. They're not born with this skill. They have to learn it. And so these two ones here can learn by watching an experienced pro, a much older one, do it repeatedly. And without any personal experience themselves, they can get quite good at it just by watching. You can call this perspective taking. It's where you're learning from watching another and you're taking their perspective of doing something. That's considered a very high level cognitive skill among most vertebrates. And we're seeing it in fishes here. And I mentioned earlier how some fishes you can train to indicate their preference for two stimuli by squirting water at a target, and that would be the archerfish. The fact that they squirt water is a very useful way to show how they will choose things. Anyway, this is a study that shows scientifically something that aquarium fish keepers had been claiming for ages. That is, they recognize me. They know it's me. They know I'm the one that feeds them. Joe comes in, he never feeds them. They ignore him. But when I come into the room, even if I'm in a crowd, they come swimming up to the glass. There's a lot of anecdotes like that. Well, now we have scientific evidence in which archerfishes were presented with various quite similar looking human faces, and then they were able to squirt water at paired pictures of different faces, and by squirting water they could show that they knew a familiar face. They could present it with 40 faces and only one of which was familiar, and they would squirt at that familiar face. So we now have scientific evidence for support for face recognition, human face recognition by a fish. What about tool use? There was not that long ago when tool use was thought to be the sole province of humans, and now we know better. We know that many animals use tools, and fishes are among them. You could say that archerfishes are using water as a tool when they use it as a projectile, but also we can find examples, and you can watch YouTube videos of this. This is a tuskfish. There's a different species being filmed you can watch on YouTube, who blows water, arguably as that's a tool, uses water as a way to uncover sand, to get sand out of the way to find a buried mollusk, picks the mollusk up in the mouth, and then swims very deliberately in a very purposeful way. I mention that because it's probably premeditated, knows where he or she is swimming to, is a he in this case, swims to a particular rock or piece of coral, and then with a series of well-timed, coordinated head flicks and releases, is able to smash that unfortunate mollusk against the rock and open it up to get the contents inside. So the rock is being used as an anvil, another tool. Note the bystanders, or I should say byswimmers, these fishes who are nearby watching the action. Fishes are opportunists. They're looking for opportunities to get some food themselves. Scavengers in this case. Do fishes have personalities? A couple of brief anecdotes to that effect. This is Razor Boy. He's a razor wrasse, photographed by Robert Wintner, the Hawaiian, who's very active on fishes, written several books, and is campaigning all the time to try to end the aquarium trade, which is a rapacious trade. In any event, he let me use this photo, and he called this fish Razor Boy, and he would see this fish on this part of the reef whenever he dove there. And Razor Boy at first was afraid of him, but after a while he got used to Robert. He knew who he was. He recognized him. I don't remember if Robert fed him, but that might be part of it. And he actually had to shoo Razor Boy away so he'd get a good photo, because he'd be in too close all the time to be able to focus the camera. I just like the photo because it conveys personality, it conveys individuality. He's a little cockeyed here. A lot of fish species can move their eyes independently, kind of like chameleons. Here's another one that was sent to me from a woman in Seattle. This is Mango, a 9-year-old Fahaka pufferfish. That's the one on the left. And she'd come home from work, the woman, and they would have these long periods of gazing into each other's eyes. She called them staring contests. I think it's, I'm really happy to see you. Probably partly because you feed me, and that's, I'm glad you're home. But two people independently asked me tonight a question I don't get very often: why do I have a pufferfish on the cover of my book? And I think the reason, one of the reasons we chose it was because we really relate to them, because their eyes are at the front of their faces. Most of the fishes, like Razor Boy we just saw, have the eyes on each side of the head. Pufferfishes, they're on the side, the front of the face, and we can just relate more to that, connect more. Plus, they have a very cute face, and they often look like they're smiling. Speaking of smiling, do fishes have emotions? Do fishes have feelings, emotional feelings? Of course they do, and there's evidence for that, and I'm going to present you some. We don't have to rely on anecdotes for this. We can look at scientific studies, and here's one looking at psychological pain or stress or distress. What happened was the research team from the University of Lisbon went to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and they caught 32 adult striated surgeonfishes. That in itself is pretty stressful. I'm sure those surgeonfishes were not happy to be taken out of their homes, and suddenly they're in this alien environment, sloshing around in a boat probably. And then they were taken to the lab, and they were subjected, some of them, to a further stress of being placed for 30 minutes in a bucket of water, just enough to cover their bodies. Not very nice. I cite scientific studies. I don't necessarily endorse them, but if I feel if I can use those studies to help make the case better for fishes, then I will do that. So people often ask me about that question, a very legitimate question, but that's where it's at for me anyway. So what they did then, and I have to explain this a little bit, they gave some of those stressed surgeonfishes the opportunity to relieve their stress by getting stroked, by getting caressed. What they did was well, let me back up. I have to explain a little background here. The two smaller fishes here are cleaner wrasses, cleaner fishes. They ply their trade on the reef by cleaning and removing parasites from so-called client fishes. This is an angelfish here in this case. I'm going to describe that in more detail a little bit later. But for this study, to describe the study, I just need to tell you that the surgeonfishes in the study, they were put one at a time in a tank after they were stressed. They were put one at a time in a tank of water, a big sizable tank, plenty of room, and the tank had a wand in it. It was a wooden wand that was designed and shaped and painted to look just like one of those cleaner fishes you just saw on that last slide. And these guys know cleaner fishes. They know what those fishes do. They get those nice cleaning treatments on the reef. And cleaner fishes also will caress. They will stroke their clients. And I'm going to get back to that as well later. But so what happened was, some of them, in some of the tanks, the model wand was stationary. It didn't move. In some of the other tanks, it was attached to a little motor that caused it to give sweeping motions. So the wand was moving back and forth. In that case, the surgeonfishes would swim up to that wand and get next to it and get stroked. They would get caressed. And the scientists, you can measure, how do you measure stress in a fish? You're taking a little sample of blood from the tail vein, and you're measuring cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. We have it in our bodies as well. Cortisol levels were very high when these fishes went into those tanks because they'd been in that bucket of water. They were probably very stressed and unhappy. And if they got stroked, their cortisol levels came down quite rapidly. They de-stressed. If that model fish was stationary and not moving, they ignored it. To just give the numbers, it was during an hour session, it was an average of 15 visits to the moving wand and 0 visits among the ones who were put in the ones with the wand that was stationary. No visits. They didn't visit it at all. Those are highly significant, statistically significant differences. And the stress levels of the ones with the stationary ones who didn't get stroked didn't come down. So it's a very clear demonstration published in the scholarly journals of stress relief, fishes being stressed and having the wherewithal to take action to relieve their stress. Emotions, back to fish emotions and stress. A Norwegian study published earlier this year documented what's called, it's very stressed behavior by salmons kept in aquaculture operations. This is fish farming. It's basically factory farming for fishes, and they're kept in large densities in small areas, a la factory farming. And a lot of individuals, I should say, are what the industry term is dropouts. They fail to thrive. This individual is the same age as this young salmon, but this one stopped eating, cannot cope with the crowding, the aggression, the competition for food, the sea parasites like sea lice that affect them, the chemicals that are used to try to combat that. It's a tough life, and some of them just can't deal with it, so they stop eating and they die. And if you measure stress in their bloodstream, it's very, very high cortisol levels, so they're highly stressed. The conclusion by the scientists was that they were severely depressed. Now, I was impressed to see the word depressed applied to fishes in a scholarly journal article, peer-reviewed article. But fishes do react and respond to anti-anxieties like Valium, antidepressants like Prozac, in ways that are consistent with what we would expect of a complex vertebrate with an endocrine system and a system for processing chemicals and drugs. Fish societies, they live with each other. They generally do, and not all species do. Some are solitary, but many, if not most, live among their own kind. And that manifests in various certain behaviors that relate to social living. And I wanted to share a few of you. Fishes often court. They have courtship, elaborate courtship in some cases before they mate. This is a couple of barred hamlets, and there's a male swimming around the female here, sort of brushing against her in circles. And interestingly, many species, 2 or 3 days later, it could be this one's a female now and this one's a male, because many species, about 1/4 of all reef fish species, can change sex, can change gender quite quickly. No expensive surgery required. And it's a useful, it can sometimes be very useful in terms of optimizing your reproductive fitness to be able to do that. Parental care is also not rare in fishes. This is a mouth-brooding species. They're called that because they have a very clever defense mechanism or a way to protect their young or their eggs. The males carry them in the mouth. And the male here is signaled to the young that there's danger, and the young swim over, and he opens his mouth and gulps them in. It looks a bit like vomiting in reverse. And then when the coast is clear, he lets them out again. It's a great way to protect your parental investment for a while. A few years ago, off the south coast of Japan, a Japanese diver and photographer, Yoji Okata, was there, and about 80 feet deep, he noticed this incredible 4 to 6 foot wide mandala-like structure of concentric rings and a fingerprint-like pattern in the middle. He didn't know what it was, and he set up his cameras, and they found that it was a previously undescribed 4-inch long pufferfish, a male who spends days, making and maintaining this beautiful crop circle down there by swimming back and forth with particular patterns of fin movements. The BBC has since been back to the site and filmed it, and there's a really exquisite BBC segment of about 4 minutes showing this behavior, and I encourage you to watch that. It's available on YouTube as well. And I mentioned male, you know why he's doing it. He's being like the peacock with the fancy tail. This is his artwork. He's trying to attract a mate and impress her with his artistry and how good he can do work. And if he's successful, a female will come and mate with him. You can see there's actually a male right there to give you an idea of scale. So this is a remarkable achievement, and I would call it artwork, fish art. I'm not quite sure why it's successful, because to me, they actually lay their eggs. They'll mate, and the female will lay her eggs in there. They'll bring stones, and they'll break shells in their mouths and drop them on there to help cover the eggs, I suppose. But to me, it looks like a big advertisement. Eggs, come here, this is where you can find them, right? So I'm not quite sure why it works. It clearly does, because it's evolved. But nature does work in mysterious ways. But we have examples of fish art. We have examples of fish fart as well, because herrings release gas from their anuses as a way of communicating. It makes a noise. The playful scientists who studied this called them frequent repetitive tics. I'll let you do the acronym. And they do this to help to make democratic decisions. This is a phenomenon now described in a number of animal species where if there's a quorum of about 60%, that's usually enough to indicate that the school or the herd wants to go to a safer place for the night, or make or fly to a neighboring pasture, or whatever the decision's about. So it's an interesting behavior that it was undescribed before, and it's the only known example of flatulence being used as a tool of communication. These are rabbit fishes. There's 4 different species here shown. There's a pair in each quadrant, and they are exhibiting a beautiful example of what we could call virtuous behavior, self-sacrificial behavior, where one individual forgoes, in this case, feeding, to benefit the other in the pair. You'll note that one of each pair is face down, feeding, foraging on algae in the reef. That's a vulnerable position to be in. You cannot see that moray eel coming to attack you. Isn't it nice to have a lookout, an individual who's looking up, not feeding, but looking around to make sure the coast is clear and everything's safe? And of course, if things are not safe, this one will signal to the other one, and then they'll both dart away and hide in the reef. And also, of course, they switch positions every few minutes, so the one who was playing lookout gets to feed as well. So it's a very nice way in which a pair of fishes can forage more safely, but it requires patience and self-sacrifice by one of the individuals at any one moment. Now we come to a pretty incredible phenomenon in any vertebrate, and it's in fishes. And it's referential signaling, it's collaborative hunting, and it's across species boundaries. It's 2 different species. What's going on here? This is not a great photo, but you can watch YouTube videos of this too. This is a large chunky fish, a grouper, lives on reefs. This phenomenon is mainly documented from the Red Sea, but it probably happens elsewhere. And a few seconds, or about a second after this still photo was taken, the grouper swims over this moray eel who's poking his or her head out of the reef and does a head shake like that. Sometimes they do a whole body shimmy, and it's a signal. It's essentially an invitation gesture. It says, I'm hungry, I'm going hunting, will you come with me? That's the translation. That's grouper for head shake, or head shake for grouper, whatever. If the moray's hungry and in the mood, they will swim off together over the reef. It looks, I'm not kidding, it looks like a scene out of a Disney film. These 2 species, this big chunky grouper and this moray eel swimming away together. Wow, it's stunning behavior. And the way it works is that they have complementary hunting styles. They both are large predators and they want to catch fishes. So if they find a fish they're interested in, they will chase it. And if the fish flees into the reef, well, the grouper can't go in there, but the moray eel can. Narrow, kind of a ferret-shaped fish can go into those nooks and crannies, may catch that fish, or if unsuccessful, the fish is going to flee where? Into the open water. Mr. or Mrs. Grouper is waiting there. So the poor fish who's targeted by this hunting pair, much less likely to get away. Careful observational studies show that the per capita success rate when they hunt together is as much as 5 times that when they hunt individually. People sometimes ask me, do they share the fish? No, as far as I know, they don't. Whoever catches it gets to eat it, but by hunting together over time, they have a much higher catch rate, and over time, both of them get lots of catches. It's called referential signaling because the head shake is independent of the actual behavior. It's referring to something else. It's referring to something unrelated, and it's referring to a future event. And so it's separate in place and time, hence referential, referring. Groupers will also point down as a pointing gesture, swim vertically with their nose pointing down if they've seen a fish swim into the reef and the moray may be somewhere else and didn't see that. And they will do that and wait for as long as 23 minutes. So far, that's the longest, that's the record. And then if the moray doesn't get the message, they'll swim over and do a head shake to recruit them and bring them over. A clever science writer named Ed Yong summed it up with a familiar jingle. If your prey's in a hole and you don't have a pole, fetch a moray. I thought that was quite clever of him to do that. I'm sorry? Why don't they share? It's a good question. You know what? Maybe they do, and maybe someone's going to document that. But my guess is they both know that they'll get some food out of this deal. So it doesn't matter if moray gets that one. I'll be getting one soon. My guess is that's the kind of thinking that goes on based on their past experience. And that's relevant too, because these are not willy-nilly teams. A series of captive experiments at the University of Cambridge in which they took realistic photos of moray eels and laminated them and controlled them as they could control what that pseudo moray eel would do with the grouper, found that groupers were quite selective, and if they had an uncooperative moray and a cooperative one, the next day they would choose the cooperative one. So they quickly learned to identify a cooperative versus a non-cooperative one. So it's a nuanced relationship that requires awareness of who's who, and they probably know each other. They've hunted before. They do this repeatedly. And they probably become more adept at cooperating the more they do it. Now, fish pain, I have to mention it. It's too bad. It shouldn't need to be mentioned. It should be a given that we should accept that fishes can feel pain. Unfortunately, there are some who continue to deny that fishes feel pain. I'll just present a little evidence for. This is a book published in 2010 in which the scientist and author Victoria Braithwaite summarizes some of her and her colleagues' experiments on trout. In some of them, they terminally anesthetized these animals, so they were unaware of any pain and they wouldn't wake up, and then they simply looked at the anatomy, and they found that there were 3 kinds of nociceptors, or pain-sensitive cells, in the faces of these fishes, and they were sensitive to 3 kinds of pain stimuli: chemical pain, heat pain, and mechanical pain. And they send signals to the brain, and conscious, awake fishes who have stimuli, who feel pain, they change their behavior. And that's consistent with the experience of pain. And what kind of behavior are we talking about here? Well, in other experiments, they injected them with an acid or bee venom in the lips, probably hurts a lot, and the trout would stop feeding. If they were given a pain-relieving drug, after that, they would feed and return to normal behavior much sooner. It doesn't prove that they feel pain. Science actually doesn't prove anything. It accumulates evidence. But really, the evidence, the weight of evidence, is clearly in their favor, as we may expect, given that they are complex vertebrate creatures. I'll describe one other study done by Lynn Snedden, a UK researcher, on zebrafishes that I think is really the gold standard method of demonstrating pain in an animal. This paradigm being used with rats and with chickens and probably other species too. The way they did it with fishes, they had them in a complex tank that had 2 chambers. On this side, they had a chamber that was dimly lit. It had lots of vegetation, rocks, places to hide. That's the kind of place that a little zebrafish likes to be because they feel safer, they can hide. It shared, in the other part of the tank was a barren chamber, brightly lit, nowhere to hide. As you may guess, approximately 30 zebrafishes in this study spend pretty much all their time in the first chamber, in the dimly lit, safe-feeling one. And then they injected them either with an acid, probably going to hurt, or they injected them with a saline solution, relatively benign, not going to cause lasting pain. After that, all of the fishes pretty much continued to swim in the dimly lit, safe-feeling chamber. They still avoided that one. And then what did they do? The scientists dissolved a painkiller, lidocaine in this case, in the barren chamber, the normally avoided chamber. And some of the little zebrafishes started swimming across and hanging out in that chamber. And it was only the ones who received the acid injection, only the ones who actually had lasting pain to relieve. So to me, that shows 3 things about pain in zebrafishes. One is, it appears they feel pain. 2, they have the wherewithal to do something about it, to actually swim over and get pain relief when it's available, a pain-relieving drug, lidocaine in this case. And 3, and I think perhaps most convincingly, they're willing to pay a cost to get pain relief. They're willing to go and swim in a place that they normally would avoid. They don't like to be in a brightly lit chamber. They feel unsafe there, and yet they're willing to make that sacrifice because, I get pain relief. So that's the paradigm that was done in this study. It's described in a paper published last year. So I feel the jury's over. The jury's put in its recommendation. Fishes feel pain. We don't need to be doing any more of these kinds of studies. We can certainly ask the question, where do we draw the line on sentience, the capacity to feel? And by the way, I just want to make a note that I co-edit a new journal. It's an online journal called Animal Sentience. It's the first ever scholarly journal about animal feelings. And we've already published more than 100 papers, articles, and commentaries in that journal. And it's free, open access. You can go to it any time and read some of these stodgy scientific papers. We try to encourage our authors not to be jargon-filled and to make it engaging writing. I just submitted a paper on pleasure, about animal pleasure, to that journal, so hopefully that'll be there soon. Anyway, we may argue and discuss, it's an interesting question, where do we draw the line on sentience? But as the sadly recently departed American philosopher Tom Reagan aptly said, draw that line in pencil, because new scientific evidence is causing us to revisit old assumptions about who feels what and who's capable of what. Do snails have fun when they're mating? Do they feel pleasure? Can they feel pain? Don't know. It's hard to tell. They're not going to tell you. There are old studies showing they will self-stimulate pleasure centers in their ganglions, in their brain-like structures. They're also in the same phylum as octopuses and squids, which the jury is pretty much not out anymore. They're conscious, they're complex invertebrates who appear to have emotions, they have personalities, they can hold grudges, they remember stuff, they can escape from amazing things. So really, the science is really causing us to revisit a lot of old assumptions about who feels what. And it's usually we were much more conservative than we should have been. I mentioned pleasure. I do want to talk a little bit about pleasure. And this is where we come to this incredible, very complex, sophisticated mutualism. This mutualism meaning a benefit, a symbiosis, both parties benefit. This is back to the cleaner-client relationship that I referred to earlier. This is, in this case, a pufferfish or a porcupine fish who is, in this case, the client. There's over 100 known client species in this relationship, in this complex assemblage. And these are the cleaners. These are two cleaner wrasses working in tandem. They are a team. They work together day in, day out. They open for business at sunup, and they swim in a certain way to say, okay, we're ready to start cleaning. And clients, if it's a busy reef, will literally line up to wait their turn to be serviced by cleaners. And you can see this is not just a casual thing. This is a cooperative relationship. This fish is opening his or her mouth to let this cleaner in, opening the gill covers, swim in there, pluck away those parasites that tend to lodge onto the gills and affect my breathing. And do clients ever eat cleaners? I don't believe it's ever been documented. It's a business relationship. It doesn't tend to advance business to eat your business partner. So it's a relationship built on trust, and it's like the grouper moray eel alliance. It's individuals who know each other. These clients return to the same cleaners, but there are reputations at stake, and it gets Machiavellian. It isn't always good service that the cleaners give. If there's no clients in the queue, it's been shown through careful studies, there's at least 150 published articles about this relationship so far. There's new papers coming out every year. It's very complicated. Studies show that if there are no clients in the queue, the cleaners tend to do a shoddier job. They don't do as good a cleaning job. Why is that? Well, there's less at stake. Their eBay ratings are not going to go down much because there's no one's watching them do a shoddy job. That doesn't mean they do make a living doing this. They get fed on the parasites. That's how I should have mentioned that earlier. The mutual benefit, of course, is that the cleaners get food and the clients get a parasite removal service and a spa treatment. So just a couple of other things about this, because it's worth mentioning. Cleaners can do a shoddy job. They do a much better job if there's a lot of clients in there. Another element of being shoddy is what's called mucus nipping. That is when a cleaner will actually bite a mote of that slimy layer on the outside. It turns out it's very nutritional, got a lot of nutrients in it. They like that, and if they can get away with it, they will. Mucus nipping tends to cause jolting by clients. The client will jolt. I don't know if it's been teased out whether that's simply because it hurts and or whether they do that to signal to the cleaners that I'm on to you, you shouldn't have done that, you stepped over the line, I'm going to be considering going to other cleaners next time. The other way, the other communication of that is that it signals to other clients in the queue, if they're there watching, that, hey, these guys aren't doing a great job today. You might want to go somewhere else. And I'm sure there'll be studies showing that clients will abort the line queue and go and queue somewhere else where the cleaners are doing a better job. This now also relates back to an earlier behavior I mentioned, which is the caressing. Remember in that surgeonfish study where they had the wands who were moving back and forth? That was to simulate what cleaners will often do to curry favor with clients. They take a break from parasite removal and they will swim up and they will simply just flutter their pectoral fins on the skin of the client. Probably feels nice. Why does it probably feel nice? Is there any evidence for that? Aside from that surgeonfish study? Yes, there is. Fishes like this NASA grouper will swim up to trusted divers on reefs, this one off the coast of Florida, to get stroked. There's no parasite removal service going on here. They just want to be petted. It feels nice. I mentioned this at a talk I gave at a vet school in Kansas last year. And one of the vet students came up to me after and said, "Sure, I know exactly that behavior. My dad and I, we see this grouper more than once on several years in a row. We've seen this grouper, or presumably the same one, on a reef in I think it was the Cayman Islands." And she said, "I'll send you some photos." So here's one photo of her stroking this beautiful, probably 10-year-old grouper, maybe older, mugging for the camera. Here we see her father with his regulator blowing bubbles underneath the open gill cover of this fish. Probably feels nice to tickle those sensitive gills. So this is a deliberate behavior where a wild creature approaches what might normally be a scary stimulus, a diver, and to get a pleasurable interaction. Not the kind of thing we would originally have thought fishes would be doing. And then here's a member of the other group, the sharks, the chondrichthyans. They also love to be belly rubbed, face stroked. You can watch YouTube videos of quite intrepid divers giving face rubs to 10-foot-long wild tiger sharks who swim up to them, probably know them, probably trust them, and get their faces rubbed. They close their eyes, well, they're nictitating membranes. They seem to be really enjoying it. It will send them into a stupor, into a super hyper-relaxed state called tonic immobility, where they're going to just be completely chilled out and relaxed. And when they're in that state, some of these beneficent divers will do an extra favor for the sharks. They will actually remove hooks from their mouths. By the way, this is Christina Zanato. She's one of the divers who does this. They wear chainmail. That's just a precaution. They know these gray reef sharks. They name them. They come back repeatedly. These are, again, like the cleaner-client relationships, trusted relationships by known individuals. And here's a blue shark photographed by a colleague of mine, Teresa Guys. You can see a very, very large fishing hook buried in this unfortunate shark's mouth. There's actually a long filament fishing line trailing. You can't see it very well in this from far away. But this shark swam among these divers, and the divers come prepared. They have bolt cutters, they have devices, tools they can use to remove these hooks. And a few minutes after this photo was taken, this shark was relieved of that hook, and the shark swam around for quite a while. You may have seen a famous YouTube video of a whale who appears to show gratitude after having fishing nets removed from his or her fins. And who knows? We shouldn't discount that a shark can feel gratitude toward divers for relieving them of this painful thing. Fishermen who catch them, they often don't want to deal with the business end of a shark, and so they just cut the line. And there's a lot of sharks swimming around with hooks, unfortunately. Do fishes play? Can play be a source of pleasure for a fish? There's now published evidence from a study of 3 male cichlids in a study that wasn't looking for play, but they noticed that they interacted in idiosyncratic ways with this buoyant, semi-buoyant thermometer that would bounce around when they bumped it with their noses. One of them would pin it in the corner, another one would bump it and then dodge out of the way. Maybe that's why they were appealed by it. It was as if it was trying to attack them back, but it couldn't. They always won the bout. Play may be used as a way to relieve boredom, and captivity certainly could lead to boredom, but it's also associated with positive affect. We tend to play when we're relaxed, when our other needs are met, and we tend to enjoy play. So play has an association with pleasure. And now I come to the very last part of my talk. I have a broader mission with what I do. Many of us do with what we do, especially with animal issues. I'm trying to change our perception of these fishes, of these creatures. Why? Well, we have a very poor relationship with them. We have taken a lot of them out of the water, out of the oceans, out of their homes. We've been fishing them intensively for centuries now. In the 1800s, there were commercial extinctions of fish species because we were exploiting them so much. And this is a sobering summation from a study published in 2015. And if you know anything about the history of commercial fishing, we'd already removed a lot of marine life from the oceans before 1970. And we measure them in millions of tons. 90 plus million tons a year. That's pretty much maxed out. Not because we're just not taking as many as we can. We're taking as many as we can. There just isn't any more to provide us with. And many of these species, as I say, are commercially extinct or in a lot of trouble. What I wanted to say with this picture, and why I mentioned that we measure them in millions of tons, is that it misses the fact that they're individuals. They are each one had a life that was precious to them, And if you actually count the numbers, it's been done, estimated, it's only an estimate. The estimate goes anywhere from a couple of 100 billion up to possibly over 2 trillion a year. The numbers are staggering. If you line them up end to end, they'd reach the sun and back, and you still have a couple of 100 billion left. And fishing is cruel, and it's not at all selective. This is a shrimp net pulled up off a boat off the coast of Mozambique. You have to look pretty hard to find any shrimp in there. Most of them are non-target species, which the industry calls bycatch. We dump 200 million pounds of bycatch back into the ocean, dead or dying marine life, every day. So a very, very wasteful, exploitative industry. You've heard of shark finning. It's horrible, it's cruel, and it's also very wasteful. And there's rigorous campaigns going on in Asia now to stop this. And we shouldn't just point our fingers at Asia. The United States is a major consumer of shark flesh as well. Fishing is also not often human-friendly. The people who work in fishing boats, there are some areas of the world where there's a slavery. Young underage workers who are not paid, and adult workers who are not paid. They're stuck on these boats for weeks or months, and they're not getting paid. It's an example of human slavery. Aquaculture or fish farming, I mentioned it earlier. It's a very difficult situation for the fishes who are crowded in there. They're unable to perform their natural behaviors. It's a stressful environment. It's also harmful ecologically, particularly these sea pens where the nets may hold in the fishes, but they don't hold in the concentrated waste products that they produce. They don't hold in the sea lice who proliferate and flourish in these crowded conditions. These are parasites that chew into the flesh, sometimes the eyes of these fishes. They can't escape them, and mortality rates of 30% are sometimes considered acceptable in the industry. The sea lice also escape and can move through out into the open water where they can afflict other wild fishes swimming by. The chemicals and pesticides, etc., that are used also leach out and affect wild populations, as do the fishes themselves. These are not normal fishes. They're not schooled in how to live in the wild, and if they escape some net tears or what, they escape into the wild, they don't flourish. They typically will not die. They may also breed with other ones in the wild and affect the gene pool. So there's a whole host of issues and concerns with aquaculture. One last one I must mention is some people will claim that aquaculture relieves the stress on wild populations. At least that's one good thing we can say about it, because these are captive animals. We're not taking fish out of the wild. It may relieve some of that stress. Turns out most of the fishes we like to eat, salmon, tuna, tilapia, they're predatory. They're high, not tilapia, but salmon and tuna and a lot of other species are high on the food chain. And so what are they fed in captivity? They're fed smaller fishes who are caught in the wild. Menhaden, for instance, which you may not have heard of, but they're in the herring family, herrings and those kinds of species. So it doesn't really relieve a lot of pressure from the wild populations, if any. That was just to show that most of the ones we eat are predatory. Just a little bit about the oceans, the habitats that fishes are living in, at least the marine ones. Climate change, oceans are warming, they're becoming more acidic. This is leading to coral bleaching. There's also the problem of ocean plastics. Everything flows downstream, and plastics tend to end up in the oceans. And plastic beads, small micro beads, are a ubiquitous product of plastic manufacturing. Also used as exfoliants. They end up in waters by the quintillions, and little baby fishes eat fish eggs, and they mistake these little plastic balls for fish eggs, and then they get stomach rupture and they die, of course. Fishing produces a lot of waste that's either left or lost in the oceans. An estimate of 680,000 tons a year of fishing gear gets left or lost in the ocean. I toyed with including a couple of photos of some fishing gear I pulled out of my 2 snorkeling operations today. Whenever I see hooks and lines, I try to bring them out with me. I stick them under my suit, or I take a bag in with me, a pouch to put them in. I always take photos of that, and I pulled out quite a lot of line today. There was a lot more there, but at least I can take a little bit out when I'm there. Many people don't realize that the oceans produce most of the world's usable oxygen. And so where the oceans go, terrestrial life is affected as well because of oxygen supplies. There's also not a lot of water on the Earth. 3/4 of the planet is covered in water, but it's a very thin veneer. And a NASA graphic here shows just how little water is available. This is the total amount of water, and about 97% of that bead of water is salt water, not really usable to terrestrial animals. The remaining 2% of the remaining 3% is frozen, although a little bit less of that as climate change is happening. And the remaining 1% is the sort of drinkable fresh water that we rely on. This is kind of a bit of a leap from the previous slide. Most of the killing that we do, most of those trillions or hundreds of billions of fishes we take is to eat them, of course, or to feed other fishes who we're going to eat. And so what we put in our mouths, dietary choices are very critical, very relevant here. And I just wanted to mention one of a number of new companies that are springing up that are making plant-based meats, plant-based fish foods. This is New Wave Foods. I visited their headquarters recently in San Leandro, California. Their first product has rolled out. It's shrimp. It's shrimp that never had a shrimp in it. It's made out of plant-based materials. There are companies, as you may know, that are doing in vitro. So it may not be very long before we have fish products that were made from fish tissue but never involved a fish. It was grown in a lab. No fishing involved, no pesticides involved, no fish farming, no fish lice, etc., no sea lice. So these are encouraging options that we now have. Many people here who are vegetarian, since it's a vegetarian society, may not even have an interest in having these products, but I think it's important that we have these choices available to consumers. I love what Sylvia Earle said about her relationship to fishes and the planet. She's sort of the Jane Goodall of the oceans, an oceanographer, scientist, fish advocate. And I'm just going to finish with a little story about Jasper, who was a discus. This is a discus fish. They come in many sizes and colors, shapes, and well, not shapes and sizes, but colors, beautiful colors. There are breeders who produce them for the aquarium trade, which is a problematic trade. I haven't really talked about that much. Robert Wintner would tell you a lot if he was here. But nevertheless, people do have relationships with fishes in captivity in their tanks. And this Jasper lived in a tank in Florida where Karen lived. Karen lives, actually, and she would come home. She'd had Jasper for many, many years, and they had developed this routine when she would come home. She would first play with him. She'd run back and forth in front of the tank, and Jasper would swim back and forth with her. It was just a sweet game that they would play. By the way, you can watch YouTube videos of deer and dogs chasing each other between the fence, on either side of the fence. Here we have a fish and a human doing the same thing. And then when she was done with that, she would cup her hands and put them under the water. And Jasper would swim onto his side and swim into her hands, swimming on his side, and she could stroke him with her thumb. It's a little awkward with the microphone, but you can tell what I'm doing, I think. And Jasper loved it. As I've hopefully convinced you, a lot of fishes like to be touched. And if you don't believe a story like that, you're just not logging enough hours on YouTube. Because I've mentioned that my favorite website many times tonight. You can watch YouTube videos of people petting fishes, holding them, picking them out of the water, and holding them up for a while, and before putting them back. These are fishes who trust them and know them and like to be petted. And so they clearly can connect with us. And I like to finish with this story because I think it's emblematic of what our relationship with fishes can be like. Not that I'm encouraging people to keep them in tanks. I would rather we did away with that habit. But nevertheless, we can have a much more salubrious, a much more positive relationship with these creatures, where we care about them, we make their lives better instead of making their lives worse. They are individuals, as I said, not just with biologies, but with biographies. They have lives that they want to live. If we have a compassionate relationship with them, if we care about them, if we treat them well, I believe in karma. It comes back to us. That's a society, the kind of society that I would like to live in too. Thank you very much.
Mahalo to all of you for coming, and have a safe return home tonight. Good night, everyone.